Hello, everyone. Hope you're well. So, there's a bit of a controversy, I guess you could say, developing around Yorkshire Cricket Club, with allegations that Michael Vaughan, who I understand is former captain, I don't follow cricket, so apologies if I get any of these details wrong in terms of positions and so on. With the allegations that he made racist comments to players of South Asian heritage. Um, Now, this taps into a wider issue over what is racist, what isn't, banter versus abuse, etc., etc. I don't want to comment too much on the Yorkshire Cricket Club story because I wasn't there. Because I just don't know what's the truth. Um, and I don't know enough about the case to be honest, so I don't want to comment too much about that. Except that I do know that banter has been used as an argument defending um, those that have been accused, well, the club really. It's not just an individual; it's the club in general that's been accused. That has been used as a sort of excuse or the defence, and that this is actually part of a wider issue of how words are used and what is racism. So the word supposedly that he was used here was PAKI. I'm not going to say the word simply because I don't. I personally think it is unpleasant term. I don't use it. But anyone in the UK will know the term I'm referring to. It's basically a term that's used for people of South Asian heritage, and it's generally seen as derogatory. It's not really used in the United States. I remember actually in one of the Jurassic World films, I think it was Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, the term was used, and it was referring to a kind of dinosaur, and that was a bit controversial in the UK. Um, this thing about banter is something that needs to be looked at a bit because I find myself sort of with mixed views on this subject. So on one hand, you have this argument that people are too sensitive, that it's political correctness, that terms like this are only used in an amicable way somehow, that it's not meant to be derogatory. Well, let me just say from the outset, I think if someone has expressed that they are uncomfortable with something, you should stop. It's as simple as that. I mean, I think the only time that there is an excuse to be stubborn about something like this is if there's no other way to express it, to express information. I mean, recently there was a BBC journalist, and she got in hot water because she used the M word in a report about a racist attack. Now, she was quoting what the assailants allegedly said to the victim, and the victim himself, a black guy, and his family wanted the term to be reported, ostensibly because they wanted to show how unpleasant this was. But the reporter ended up getting lots of heat from Black Lives Matter. They were furious that she dared to use the term on air, even though she was simply quoting a crime. She wasn't using the term herself, she was quoting what was allegedly said. Now, to me, that's crazy to give a journalist a hard time over that. And I think the BBC actually dug in on that one and didn't apologise, which I think is an occasion where they got it right. I don't think they should have, because journalists have to have the freedom to do their job. Um, Obviously, whilst respecting journalistic ethics and truth. But that was an example of a journalist doing her job and getting a hard time for doing it. Um, I mean, it's crazy that people would be more concerned about the word used than the actual violent attack that took place. And this is very much the case in the United States when you have, it seems these days, that violence is seen in a lesser light than controversial words. It's just crazy. I mean, if you get someone accused of being a racist, you could get a mob outside their house in the United States, and that will be justified. But there might be looting or rioting, and that's kind of, well, will be condemned. But it's not seen in the same light as the use of a controversial word. That's crazy. And I understand the American history that there is a context of racial issues being very, very sensitive. I get that. You know, most countries have an issue that is particularly sensitive. In the United States, it's unquestionably race, perhaps more than any other, perhaps more than the gun issue, more than the abortion issue. You know, they're hot button issues, but I think race is more inflammatory than any other issue in America. In Britain, not quite as much, but we have certainly had our issues. Now, the problem with this sort of one size fits all approach, i.e., use of a term is always racist. There's the example I just gave. It stops journalists doing their job from reporting the facts of the case, i.e., if a racially charged term was used. It stops writers or puts up a barrier to writers being creative. You know, if I were to write a short story set in 1920s Alabama in the Jim Crow era, it would be hard to talk about racism without actually citing an example. And part of that would be using racially charged terms. I am fully aware that as a white writer, I could get heat for that for just using the terms, even though I think they're horrible terms. But using it, for example, if I have a character who's a clan member, um, he's not going to say, "Dear black fellow, please leave your house because I don't want you here." No, he's going to use hateful, inflammatory language, isn't he? So this idea that certain terms should just never be used, I think, is absurd because it takes away context. Um, and then there's this issue of double standards. I mean, black rappers use the term all the time, and people of British Pakistani descent often use that term, which I mentioned at the start of the video, PAKI, about themselves. So I think it's a bit of a weak argument to say, well, it's not racist when we do it, but it is racist if you do it. It sends out the wrong message. And I know there's this argument about uh, taking ownership of the word and so on. That's why some gay men actually use terms that are quite unpleasant when referring to themselves. Um, but I'm not sure that it's the most sensible approach. I mean, that's fine if you're going to not give others a hard time about it, but otherwise, it's just plain double standards. Um, you know, I can use it because I am one of this demographic, but you can't. I think it just sends out the wrong message. But getting back to this issue about banter, what is banter and what is racism? Well, I don't like woke ideology. I don't like political correctness, and I think it is unhealthy for people to go around being overly sensitive. Right. But by the same token, I do think that some people seem to think that they have a right to just be obnoxious and they have a right to say as they please with no accountability, with no responsibility at all. Um, and they can just always hide behind, oh, well, it's just banter, you know, lighten up, have a sense of humor. If the other person is uncomfortable, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever, there's no necessity to continue doing it. There just isn't. And I do feel that sometimes the term banter is used to defend basically bullying. I don't like to say racism, I think it's a loaded term, and I think that's a very specific thing. Um, but, you know, if someone is saying they don't like a particular term, don't use it. There's just, I don't see why anyone would push to do that unless they want to be obnoxious, unless they want to make the other person uncomfortable. I mean, even if someone's overly sensitive, it's still not a reason to push it. Okay, so this can apply to other areas as well, not just in race. Take, for example, the transgender issue. You know, I do not like the way the trans lobby engage in bullying of women. I do not like the denial of basic science. And I hate the way that pronouns have been weaponized. Um, but if I meet a trans person, if they want a particular pronoun to be used, I'm not going to use a different pronoun just to wind them up. Or even if I fundamentally disagree with this idea that biology doesn't matter, or that um, you know, it's okay to talk about people who breastfeed in these sort of ridiculous woke terms that are used to try and please the trans lobby. Okay, all of that is something that I think is obvious, but it still doesn't mean I'm going to deliberately seek to offend someone just for the sake of it. That's to me, there's nothing practical about that. There's nothing in that. Now, if a trans person says to me, trans women are no different than biological women, I'll take issue with that statement. I won't agree with it, and they cannot force me to agree with it. But if they personally want she, her pronoun being used, I'll respect that simply because I'm not losing anything by not respecting it. And, it means that you have a respectful conversation and at least there's some groundwork there. If I just go in and say, well, I don't consider you to be a woman, so I'm going to continue calling you he or him, that's just unnecessary. It's aggravating and it's just unnecessary. Um, in terms of racial issues, again, context is very important. Now, if you're at a social event and you're making a conversation, I've used this example a few times, and you ask someone, where are you from? Um, if as a white guy, I ask another white person that, it's probably there's no issue there. But if I was to ask a black person or an Asian person, they might assume that to mean I'm saying they're an outsider. Now, in my line of thinking, it's simply making conversation, no different than saying, "Oh, do you like the food?" or "Do you like the music?" or "What's your name?" I think it's just another form of making conversation. Now, here's the catch: you need to listen to people and you need to respect their answers. So if someone says, like, let's say you have a situation where someone is an ethnic minority person and they say, well, I'm British, I'm from Liverpool or Birmingham, and the other party says, oh, but where are you really from? Now, I can totally understand them getting irritated by that, and even offended, because it implies that they are the other, that they're an outsider simply because they're not white. And that, I totally understand the frustration with something like that. I've experienced it myself, and I want to use a personal anecdote here. When I arrived in England 21 years ago, I got a pretty rough time. Firstly, I was living in a rough area, but also in my new school, I was immediately cast as an outsider because of my accent. So I got no end of paddy this, paddy that, and IRA this, IRA that. And for me, it was all a bit overwhelming because I'd grown up in Northern Ireland at that point, 14 years. I came to England. I really didn't know anything about the Troubles. I mean, I knew of the terminology, but I didn't really understand it, not at that age. So paradoxically, that experience of being bullied, and that's really what it was because it was relentless and it really got me down. It actually made me research and find out more about my background and where I'm from and Northern Ireland and the Troubles. But in the last 20 years, I have lost count of the number of times that people have come up to me, and this could be in a social event, it could be even in work. For example, I have volunteered in a charity shop, and it could be a customer. It could be something like, "Oh, that's a nice accent. Where are you from?" And I'll say, "Oh, well, Belfast originally, but I've grown up here, Northeast England." Now, to me, someone being curious and asking about my accent, I absolutely have no problem with that. I think it's fine because, they obviously notice that I obviously haven't lost it in 20 years. So I'm just happy to tell them. But here's the thing. If I say, well, I'm Northern Irish, or even if I say I'm British, and then they sort of insist in ignoring what I'm saying, like a classic would be, "Oh, I've got a friend in Ireland," or "I visited Ireland last year," and I'm thinking, "Well, that's good. Why are you telling me? I've just told you I've grown up here." So it is irritating when people ignore what you're saying. For me, it's kind of like I don't want to go around with a chip on my shoulder. I don't want to go around being overly sensitive and wanting to be offended. But I also feel I shouldn't have to sort of tell people. I shouldn't have to kind of reiterate something when I've already said it. This gets into a question of basic respect. So getting back to the issue of Yorkshire Cricket Ground, if there's an atmosphere there where, that term is being thrown around and people have complained and others are saying, oh, well, lighten up, it's just banter, that's playing wrong and they need to drag themselves into the year 2021. If someone is uncomfortable with something, you don't continue it. Simple as that. Because banter, true banter should be inclusive. It should be like both ways. It should not be feeling like it's targeted at an individual or even it makes an individual uncomfortable. So, as much as I dislike woke ideology and political correctness, and I don't think it's good for people to be overly sensitive, I also believe in basic respect, i.e., listen to what someone's saying. Um, I mean, I understand, for example, if there's a British Chinese person and they feel that they are always being seen as an outsider, like, oh, what part of China are you from? When they may well have been born in the UK and grown up in the UK. But what I would respectfully say is don't automatically think it's racism. It might just be the other person being a bit stubborn. Now, I think if you tell them and they persist, then it might start to get into another area. But if they simply ask where you're from, that's not being racist. It's simply making conversation. Of course, it depends on the context. If they say that, oh, where are you from? You could tell by body language, you could tell by the tone of voice. For me, the constant questions about, constantly being designated as an Irish guy, it's irritating because I'm not Irish. I'm British. I'm from Northern Ireland. People from Northern Ireland very much feel like British citizens, or at least I shouldn't speak for everyone. A lot of people do. So I think that people aren't malicious, but they're just ignorant. They just seem to not grasp. A lot of people in England don't get this. They seem to think Northern Ireland, Ireland, it's all the same thing. It's all over there. It's very irritating because it takes away my sense of British identity, which is something I feel strongly about. I'm patriotic. I love my country. So if I'm treated as the other, it's taken away something from me that is an important part of my identity. Um, and I just ask that people respect that. But I do it in such a way that I'm not going around with a chip on my shoulder, always complaining. And I certainly think it's important to look at context in the way that it is given. But for this case, I think if there is a culture of banter, it needs to change. I'll just close with this thought. I don't really like the idea of banter because I think too often it is excused. It is a way to excuse bullying. I think it's a particular problem in the armed forces and in the emergency services, for example, the police. Recently, there was actually a case in the armed forces. I think it was involving the household cavalry, but don't quote me on that. It may have been another unit. So I think it was them, but that's not certain. Anyway, there was two recruits, two soldiers, I should say. It was beyond the recruiting stage. One from Northern Ireland, one was a Muslim guy, and they both complained that they were being abused by fellow troops. The Northern Irish guy said he'd been mocked as being, he was called Jerry Adams. He had IRA thrown at him, and obviously this caught my attention. With the Muslim guy, it was even more serious. He'd alleged that he'd actually been a victim of assault, that he asked a fellow soldier to stop mocking his religion, and the guy assaulted him, punched him after a night of drinking. Now, it's not far-fetched to imagine young squaddies had a few drinks. It is a macho environment that could happen. This particular unit, and I'm not going to say it because I'll get it wrong, but apparently this particular unit of the army, this particular branch of the army, I should say, has a reputation for boisterous banter. Well, the first thing I think of is deep cut barracks. If you don't know, this was a scandal at barracks in the south of England. I think it was in Surrey, where five recruits, initially thought to be four, it was actually five young recruits took their own lives between 1995 and 2002. Five of them. Bullying was cited as one of the main reasons for that. So I think the armed forces need to take this very seriously. Banter um, becomes something else when it's targeted at an individual. I should say in that recent case I mentioned, there was an investigation and the two guys that were accused were totally exonerated. So that's the other side of it. Their defense representative said that actually the accusers had made it up as they went along and they gave as good as they got. But the allegations included physical abuse, it included things being stolen, it included bed being wet. You know, that sort of prank, when it's done excessively, that can really, really wear someone down. But, you know, this was investigated and the findings were that it wasn't all as it seemed. So that's why it's important to establish the facts of every case. But I personally think that the armed forces, the emergency services, you know, they cannot always say, "Oh, it's just banter, it's just team spirit," or that sort of thing. If an individual's being targeted, if there is this atmosphere where, for example, female recruits in the police are being sexually harassed, you cannot say that's banter. I mean, there's some real obnoxious people out there. I'm thinking of people, you know, you're going down the street, minding your own business. I've had this young men, it's particularly young men, they just shout out nonsense. And I'm thinking, wait a second, you don't know me. I don't know you. What the hell? What's your problem? I really have contempt for people who do that. And you could be damn sure that they wouldn't do it if they're on their own. You know, it's a group mentality, it's cowardly. Um, but I just cannot understand people who cannot leave other people alone. And the only way they can seem to be entertained is by winding up others or giving others a hard time. It's disgusting, actually. It's infantile. It's not masculine. This is the thing about banter. I think often it's, you know, it's defended as a positive masculine building. It really depends on the context. I think if it's inclusive and, you know, it's everyone getting the same treatment and it's kind of like a mutual thing between friends, that's different, obviously. But when it is targeted at an individual and when the individual has made it clear that they're not happy, and of course the problem is in the army or the police, any individual that complains, they'll be accused of being too sensitive. They'll be accused of being, you know, so there has to be a system where they can comfortably complain if they really do feel that that's, you know, um, that they really are being made to be unhappy because of this. I guess it's different if, you know, there has to be reason involved. If someone, let's say you have a workplace, and let's say a racially charged term is used in the spirit of banter, but someone takes issue with that, what I would say is they should raise the issue directly. What they shouldn't do is go to management and say, oh, well, this person's being racist. Then the person finds their job on the line when they honestly didn't realize that the person had taken offense. But I also think common sense should be involved. Um, Certain words are known to be racially offensive, so just don't use them. I mean, context is so important, but finally, I just think be respectful. Don't be a dick. Don't go out of your way to give someone a hard time. And yes, don't be overly sensitive either. But honestly, when it comes to the whole banter thing, my sympathies lie more with those who are made uncomfortable because I think, honestly, I think banter is overused as a way to defend basically bullying behavior. But context is everything. Let me know your thoughts.